A decade ago, I began the habit of going out every Monday night to a local pub where an Irish band plays pretty much the exact same set of songs every single week. Monday is sort of a pastor's weekend, and I found that no matter what I might be worried about or angry about or depressed about, that a couple of hours of Irish drinking songs and a couple of pints of Guinness would at least temporarily soften an old vicar's heart. Over the years, different friends have joined me in this ritual so that I'm really never there alone. It's become sort of our unofficial communion service. Our little congregation has various members drop in from time to time as we break bread and lustily sing about the days when we were a wild rover, or help raise the sails in choruses of Irish sailing songs like John Connect. But mostly, we've heard all these songs so many times that we no longer listen. We just visit with each other, we make plans for the week ahead, and generally toast one another's genius, because from time to time, your genius needs to be toasted. But I find that there's one song that never fails to demand my undivided attention. And I'll even shush people around me to make everyone be still and listen to the fields of Athenry. It's a ballad that tells the story of a young mother who's weeping as her husband is being carried away in a prison ship to Australia. His crime was having stole corn to keep his children from dying of starvation during what we Americans call the Irish potato famine and what the Irish call the Great Hunger. We know that more than 1 million Irish immigrated to the United States in the mid-1800s to escape the famine. Perhaps as many as 1 million died of starvation just 4 years. Millions more fled in other directions. I've taken the train, as I suspect some of you have, from Dublin to Galway, and you see an entirely depopulated country that once had 9 million people in it in the early 1800s, and it went down to about half of that in the generations that followed, never to recover. Potatoes were a staple food of the poor, and you might wonder, when the potato vines were being struck by this blight, this virus, why didn't they grow something else? Well, they did. In fact, all during the famine, Ireland was a major grain exporter. It's just that the grain belonged to the British, and the Irish were expected to eat only increasingly rare potatoes. Ships carried Irish produce to markets in England and Europe, while other ships carried poor Irish farmers who had stolen grain, many off of their own farms, out of their own fields, to feed their starving family. But they were sent in chains to work camps in Australia. Many sent off on those prison ships died en route. The circumstances on the ships were terrible, and most were never reunited with their own family. More than 4,000 ships loaded with grain. Imagine this, tiny Ireland. More than 4,000 ships loaded with grain left Ireland for ports in England in 1847, in the height of the potato famine, when 500,000 Irish starved to death that year alone. Somehow, poor Irish farmers had largely accepted an economic system that locked them into poverty and then into hunger, while they continued to labor to make distant landowners wealthy. So when they sing the fields of Athenry, I stop. And I'll admit, the older you get, the easier it is to start crying, but I'll admit, it's almost impossible for me to hear that song and not start to leak around my face. And folks, I'm not of Irish descent. My family's from England, which in many ways makes this story that much worse.
By a lonely prison wall, I heard a young girl calling. sow travail and scorn, so the young might see the morn. Now a prison ship lies waiting in the bay. Low lie the fields of Athenry, where once we watched the small free birds fly. Our love was on the wing, we had dreams and songs to sing. It's so lonely round the fields of Athenry. By a lonely prison wall, I heard a young man calling. Nothing matters, Mary, when you're free. Against the famine and the crown, I rebelled, they put me down. Now you must raise our child with dignity. Low lie the fields of Athenry, where once we watched the small free birds fly. Our love was on the wing, we had dreams and songs to sing. It's so lonely round the fields of Athenry. By a lonely harbor wall, she watched the last star falling. As the prison ship sailed out against the sky, sure she'll live and hope and pray for her love in Botany Bay. It's so lonely round the fields of Athenry. Low lie the fields of Athenry, where once we watched the small free birds fly. Our love was on the wing, we had dreams and songs to sing. It's so lonely round the fields of Athenry.
The famine lasted from 1845 until 1849, and the horrors of that time became a part of Irish self-understanding. Now, the potato famine returned in 1879, but the Irish had changed in the 30 years of self-awareness that the economic system that allowed distant landlords to starve them to death was absolutely not going to happen again. They revolted, they threw off their landlords, they retook possession of their own properties, and British profits had to suffer. Now, that's the change I really want us to think about today, is that this economic system continues to crush people only because we accept it. When indeed is enough enough? What does it take for the poor to revolt? It was an unguarded moment when the radical founder of the Catholic worker movement, Dorothy Day, said, "The problem is our stinking, rotten system and our acceptance of it. As soon as we stop accepting it, it will have to change." Now, most of us were reared to believe that capitalism was just a part of the fabric of Christianity and democracy, that we were taught to hate communists and socialists, and that the way that our country runs in a supply and demand economy was what Jesus wanted us to be when he wrote our Constitution. We believe that our Constitution and body of laws make us free and independent, but we've always had this proverb that played around the edges of all of our talk about freedom and independence, and that is that possession is 9/10 of the law. It is legal to use the police to protect private property. It is legal to lobby for a tax structure that taxes the rich at a rate that is less than half of the rate on which the poor are taxed. It's legal to pay wages that guarantee poverty for your employees. But then you have to stop and think, who writes those laws? Why are 9/10 of the laws about possession? Because the people with the most possessions write the laws. You've heard me say it before, there are 3 lobbyists on Capitol Hill representing just the pharmaceutical industry for every single elected member of Congress. This book we're studying in class now on corruption in the United States by Zephyr Teachout. In the chapter we read this week, she says $12.5 million of political donations go into the coffers of every single member of Congress. Now, that's an average, of course, but you think about $12.5 million to get Billy Long reelected to Congress. And could you waste money at a more grand scale? But come on. How many lobbyists are there on Capitol Hill advocating for a living wage for the people who cook your lunch and mop your floors? You may remember a few years ago, several dozen of us joined together with a local labor union to have a demonstration for living wages at a McDonald's. We picked a very busy McDonald's on the north side of town in a relatively poor neighborhood, and our intent was simply to encircle the McDonald's with our signs so that everybody knew why we were there and what we were protesting. We didn't block traffic. We didn't impede business. You know, we're church folk. We're not good at anarchy or anything. You know, we were mostly senior citizens saying that a business that makes as much money as this business makes ought to be able to pay their employees a wage that they could live on. Within 10 minutes of our arrival, there were 8 patrol cars and a paddy wagon there to haul off all of us gray-haired liberals if we kept even one person from getting their Egg McMuffin in a timely manner. Now, I've volunteered with homeless programs in the same neighborhood for years. We used to have fights break out at Bill's place, and it could take the police hours to respond. Even an ambulance wouldn't come very quickly. So who do the police work for? What are the priorities of business, government, and for that matter, most of the church? That you can get 8 police cars in 10 minutes because we're protesting wages at McDonald's. The police, the government, and most of the big steeples defend the filthy, stinking economic system that creates and defends poverty. This poster attempts to explain our economic systems in the world. They use cows. I thought that was cute, but this is basically economics as we were taught when we were kids. In socialism, if you've got 2 cows, the state takes one of them, or you give it to your neighbor. Oh, thank you. Then in communism, you have 2 cows, the state takes both of them and gives you some milk. In fascism, where'd that go? Yes. You have 2 cows, the state takes both of them and then sells you some milk. But if we skip to the end, which is really the point of this illustration, in traditional capitalism, you have 2 cows, you sell one, you buy a bull, you build a big, huge herd, and you retire on the profits. And that sounds so wonderful. That's the way to do it. Capitalism is an economic system that can reward innovation, hard work, frugality, investment, and intelligence. The only problem with this illustration is that most of you have never owned a cow. Most of us just work for the dairy industry. The United States does not have just one economy. We have several. There are actually very few people in America who are capitalists. School teachers aren't capitalists. They don't own the school building. They don't charge the students. They are employed by the state and paid through property taxes. If that isn't socialism, I don't know what is. Firefighters are not capitalists. Our military works in a virtually communist system. Our police work in a socialist system. And for heaven's sakes, folks, I'm not a capitalist. I work for this little socialist coven that we call a church. Do you know who a capitalist is? Only people who have capital, i.e. cows, to invest. Paris Hilton is a capitalist because she inherited ownership of a large hotel chain and several related businesses. But you know, Paris Hilton does not make money based on innovation, hard work, frugality, or intelligence. She makes, don't enjoy it too much. I'm not trying to be mean, I'm just explaining economics here. She makes money the old-fashioned way. She inherited it. All of the people who are changing the sheets on the beds at Hilton hotels, who mop the floors, who carry the room service trays, who work at the front desk and mow the lawn, they're not capitalists. They are labor, and labor is an overhead expense. They are the cost of doing business, and in unbridled capitalism, you're always looking for a way to cut overhead in order to increase profits, so that the worse you treat the people who are your labor force, the more rewarded you are for being a good capitalist. An economic system, though, is just a way of distributing goods. There's a certain amount of land. There's a certain amount of ability to produce goods. So if you imagine our country as an island on which 10 people are shipwrecked on a 10-acre island. And there's lots of fruit trees and obviously seafood. And so they have a sustainable life. After a time, they divide up their 10-acre island into 1-acre plots. Everybody builds their own shelter, and they can exchange labor and goods with each other, and they lead a sustainable life. In fact, one that looks pretty good to me right about now. But one of these 10 homeowners learns how to ferment fruit juice, and he invites his neighbors over for drinks and a card game, and his 9 unsuspecting neighbors get drunk and lose their acres in a night of card gambling. The winner now tells the other 9 that he now owns their houses, all of the land on the island, and that they either work for him at his pleasure or they don't get to eat or even drink the water on the island. Now, clearly, those 9 people, even though they had agreed to drink the fruit juice and to play cards, they're not going to accept that arrangement for long, right? The difference is that most of us were born on the island, and there was always just 10% of the people who owned virtually everything, and the rest of us were required to serve their wishes. In the mid-19th century, there were babies born in England who were born owning farms in Ireland. And there were babies born in Ireland who were born to work the fields for the English babies that owned their farms. And both the Irish and the English grew up thinking, this is how the world works. This is how the system is. It just is. It's not bad or good. It's just this is the isness of creation. The system was so ingrained in both the English and the Irish that both sides followed the rules of the system, even as one became increasingly wealthy and the other was slowly starving to death, at least in the first potato famine. People come to accept this. And folks, everyone here was taught in high school about the history of child labor in the United States. You know that the children of the poor were forced to work in our textile factories along the East Coast, sitting at looms and doing dangerous work, breathing in dangerous fumes from the fabrics, and typically dying very young or being seriously injured. We look back on that era of American history with a great deal of shame and no small amount of confusion. How could a largely Christian democratic state have ever instituted this kind of child slavery? How could we have done it? But I want to tell you this. About 20 years ago, I was leading a tour of a couple of dozen church members through Israel and Egypt. And when we were nearing the step pyramids pyramid in Memphis in Egypt, our tour bus stopped at an Egyptian rug factory, and my church folk were led through the factory where hundreds of children, 5, 6, 7 years old, sat at large looms weaving rugs. We had about a 5-minute walk through the factory when the guy from the factory was telling all these good Christian folk that had come to see the birthplace of Christianity, that if it were not for this industry, these children would be starving to death and they'd never get an education. They'd never learn a trade. So really we're doing them a favor, because how else would they eat if we didn't enslave them and abuse them? This is not as hard as they try to make it out to be. But when we went into the gift shop of that factory, virtually every one of those good Christians bought a rug. They had seen the children making them. It only took 5 minutes of a speech to convince them that the rug that they took rolled up back to the bus was actually going to help those children. How can you get that stupid that fast? And yet the church does it over and over and over again. Now, this really doesn't have to be hard. Never drink and gamble with a pirate. Got that? Secondly, don't passively accept a filthy, rotten system that impoverishes the masses for the enrichment of the few. There is a way to make capitalism work, a way that rewards innovation, hard work, frugality, and intelligence, but doesn't have to starve anyone. And it really isn't that hard. Our economic system is a blending of capitalism and socialism with a little bit of fascism. Darwin's theory of evolution is not actually based on a survival of the fittest. It's not the strongest that survive. It is the one that is the best able to adapt. A species is most likely to survive if they are able to adapt to changing circumstances. Every species in the world is faced with a choice between heading towards extinction or continuing to adapt to changing circumstances. At this moment in history, the growing gap between the rich and the poor, the expanding disparity of income in America, threatens to bring our culture to the brink of extinction. The invisible hand of the market will not save us. Unbridled capitalism has one goal. It has no conscience. It will not correct itself to improve the standard of living of the poor. Seeing this freight train rolling down the tracks, earlier this year, the so-called middle-class tax cut actually cut taxes on the super wealthy and shifted the tax burden more squarely onto the shoulders of the middle class. The investor class, suddenly experiencing a windfall, invested in the market largely through stock buybacks. So earlier this year, the market surged to new heights. But what no one wanted to talk about was the fact that it was surging to new heights on the strength of borrowed money. And that can never last for long. If you go to a casino and take money out against your credit card to gamble with, you are about to hurt yourself. And that is what we did with that tax cut. I am afraid we are already seeing the necessary corrections that will exacerbate what a horrible economic move that tax cut was. But there are two issues involved in this. Income is one thing, capital is another thing. There are the people who own the cows, and their income comes from their investment. Then there are the people who milk the cows, haul the hay, muck out the barn, build the fences, and work in the slaughterhouse. And whether those people can afford to buy a bottle of milk will depend not on the generosity of the capitalist. You don't want to bank on that. It will depend on the legal system that we have in place. With the recent tax cut, the rich were rewarded and the poor were punished. But possibly even worse, the same tax cut included an estate tax cut. Now, income is one issue, capital is another. When you cut inheritance taxes so that people who are fabulously wealthy are allowed to simply pass that wealth on to the next generation so that it's never redistributed. It never goes back into the marketplace. We're not only hurt on the income side of things, but we're rigging the system so that capital is held in the hands of fewer and fewer people who are already rich, and that will destroy an entire civilization. As long as the wealthy can transfer their wealth to the next generation without a significant part of it being put back into the public arena, then we continue to stand on the tracks waiting for that train to just run us down. Because the train is coming, and the conductor is a capitalist, and he ain't going to stop for you. He's just not going to. In his famous book about capital, the French economist Thomas Piketty says, "The durability of this system depends on the effectiveness of its apparatus of justification." That's not a small thought. To perpetuate our current economic system, what has to be in place is the persuasion to make the victims of the economic system believe that it's fair and just. I'm here to tell you, and I'm a fairly clever boy. I mean, I might be wrong, but in this case, I'm not. There is no justification for this system. That is, as long as you, the voters in Western democracies, are willing to be convinced that this filthy, rotten system is the only way the world can be, then there is a fairly inevitable end to unbridled capitalism. And let me give you a clue. You are not going to like it. The Yellow Vest protests in Paris this week are a united reaction to a similar tax shift in France, in which a tax on the super rich was eliminated, and they made up for the income by adding fuel tax to gasoline, a tax largely paid by people that are having to drive to work or the poor that are going to wash somebody's windows and mop their floor, people who are already being taxed into poverty. And I want to tell you, when I wrote this first draft of this message earlier this week, I'm making the English sound so bad, so horrible for exploiting the Irish, that 1 million of them starved to death while they were growing grain and shipping it to England. I sent the manuscript to our friend John Churcher in London, and I said to him, "John, is this an accurate depiction? Is this fair?" And sadly, he acknowledged that it was a fair depiction of a very bad chapter in English history. But then a couple of days later, John sent me an article about this woman. Her name is Pretty Sushi Patel. Her name is Pretty Sushi. That is her name. She's a British politician. She was born and reared and educated in England, but evidently has only a sketchy awareness of British history. As England is negotiating their exit from the European Union, she suggested this week that in order to put more pressure on the EU for acceptable terms for the Brexit, she suggested that they restrict food shipments to Ireland, the part of Ireland that's remaining in the EU. Pretty Sushi thinks that starving Irish people will be in England's best economic interest. Yeah. Honestly, folks, you couldn't make this stuff up. Now, even if her name sounds like a character in an Austin Powers movie, and it does, this is not fiction. This is just a sign of how governments act if the people will accept this filthy, rotten economic system that creates and defends and expands poverty. There was a time in human history when poverty and hunger were caused by scarcity, and we were always just one harsh winter or one bad growing season away from becoming destitute. But in the presence of modern industry, advanced agricultural sciences, medicine, and banking, the only reason there is still poverty is because of greed. And I would like to submit for your consideration that that is no longer acceptable.
Preaching.
Thank you for watching our videos. We are entirely dependent on the donations of our listeners and members.
We hope that you find this content to be important enough to help us to keep offering these videos to the public at no charge by becoming a regular contributor. Please click on the donate button on our website at www.spfccc.org. Thank you for your support of progressive religious programming.